Well, it took 4 long months, but it's finally here, in full. The Chancellor's Autumn Budget. It's a weighty tome, but of course it's not just this document that was published alongside the statement from the Chancellor. No, the much venerated Office for Budget Responsibility published what's known as the Blue Book. It's an even thicker document, and this, in effect, marks the homework of the Chancellor. In many ways, looking at this Blue Book is more important than the Red Book of the fiscal changes announced. We're going to dive into today some of those issues raised by the Office for Budget Responsibility. Now, clearly, the OBR is a body that has come under political criticism in recent years. However, it's important to note just how highly the Chancellor puts the OBR in her regard. So, given that the Chancellor thinks that the OBR is this all-seeing body, given that the Chancellor thinks that the OBR's words should be taken seriously, we should certainly take seriously the effects that the OBR thinks Rachel Reeves' budget will have on working people. And to that end, let's dive straight into one of the most contentious elements within the budget, and that is the national insurance rise for employers. Rachel Reeves announced one of the highest ever single tax rises on the United Kingdom. This was, of course, the rise in national insurance, scheduled to raise £25 billion, more than half the total tax rises included in her fiscal package. Now, this will be done through 2 main prongs. Number 1, there is a rise in the national insurance rate up to 15%. That's a 1.2% rise for employers. But beyond that, there is a threshold cut. Yes, employers only had to pay national insurance for their employees above £9,100 annual salaries. Rachel Reeves' budget has cut that threshold to just £5,000 a year. That means anyone earning £9,000 or more will be subject to £600 extra tax on their employment. Indeed, it also means that someone earning the average salary will now cost a firm more than £900 extra every year. That's not just a cost for businesses, that's also a cost for workers. And here's where it gets politically difficult for the Chancellor. Because this tax rise has been stipulated and assessed by the OBR, we can see where the OBR thinks this tax rise will fall. In the Blue Book from the OBR, they suggest that real earnings will grow by 2.4% this year and 1.2% in 2025. However, due to the national insurance rise, that is where real wage growth stops. Indeed, real earnings growth stalls, according to the OBR, in 2026 and 2027, as firms rebuild margins, and here's the killer quote, as employers pass on the cost of higher employer national insurance contributions. There you have it, in black and white, from the Office for Budget Responsibility. This tax rise will not just be paid by businesses, it will be passed on to employees. And what does that mean for you? Well, we can see in the graphs from the Office for Budget Responsibility, from 2026 and 2027, real wage growth dips below that zero line. That's real wage shrinkage in 2026 and 2027. That happens for 2 reasons. Number 1, those tax rises are being passed on to employees. That means lower than expected wage rises. But number 2, there's an awful lot of borrowing in this budget, more than £30 billion of extra borrowing. That, of course, has an implication on inflation. The Office for Budget Responsibility believes that extra borrowing directly leads to higher inflation. What does that mean? They have modelled 0.5% higher inflation than otherwise we would have expected over the course of the Parliament. So you marry those 2 things together, lower than expected real wage rises and higher than expected inflation, that means lower than inflation wage rises, real terms, wage cuts. Now, another crucial element of this budget is the total tax take, sometimes what's referred to as the tax burden, the percentage of the economy that is taken up in tax as a share of GDP. This is modelled by the Office for Budget Responsibility, and the results are pretty shocking. The Labour Party in opposition said that the tax burden had got too high, that they would like to bring down the tax burden. But as we know, taxes in this budget have risen by £40 billion, and we can model that on the tax burden that the country faces. National accounts taxes as a share of GDP is the way the OBR describe it. And we can see here in this graph, originally the tax burden was expected to rise, yes, but then mellow out. That's the yellow line. The blue line shows what taxes are doing now, soaring far beyond the peak that they were expected to hit. This is the highest tax burden the country has faced in recorded history, taking the share of taxes out of GDP up to almost 39%. That's a huge, huge amount. But there's more to it than that, because spending as a share of GDP is expected to go far, far higher. Yes, under these plans, there's still a significant gap between the amount spent and the amount taken in. And what meets that gap? It's borrowing. It's borrowing that the OBR suggests will raise the rate of inflation by 0.5% over the course of the Parliament compared to where otherwise inflation would have been. And also we hear from the OBR that interest rates will be 0.2% higher than otherwise they would have been as a result of that higher inflation. We've seen it time and time again. More government borrowing leads to higher inflation, leads to higher interest rates. That is a direct consequence of these fiscal changes as modelled by the OBR. It's perfectly legitimate to criticise the OBR. It's perfectly legitimate to say that you disagree with their working. But that's not what the Chancellor has done. Year after year, month after month, we've heard how much the Chancellor has venerated the OBR. So ironically now, she must accept their assessment that her budget means ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, inflation will be 0.5% higher and interest rates 0.25% higher, 25 basis points higher. And then we turn to growth. Growth is the watchword of this government. It was the #1 campaign priority from the Prime Minister as he described his national missions for change. Growth was the #1 mission that he set out. The highest sustained growth in the G7 is the mission. How does it fare? How does the OBR score that mission after this budget delivered by Rachel Reeves? Well, it's fair to say that in the first year that is modelled, growth goes up. The OBR did a similar exercise back in March at the last budget. They expected growth this year to be 1.9%, 2025 that is. It's now been revised upwards to 2%. That's a 0.1% upwards revision. That, however, is where the good news comes to an end. Because the next year, 2026, it's down by 0.2%, from 2 to 1.8. The following year, 2027, it's down to 1.5. The following year, 1.5. The following year, 1.6. By international standards, this is anemic growth. It's nowhere near the 3% growth that the United States is enjoying. And therefore, it's nowhere near being the highest sustained growth level in the G7. Now, why is that? Well, our friends at the Office for Budget Responsibility have modelled some of the tax changes and other changes, the spending changes in this budget. We can see the policy impacts on real GDP in this graph. You can see that the demand multipliers that the government has spurred on, the public investment that the government has engaged in, does drive up growth. But on the other side of the ledger, you see employer national insurance contributions, that tax rise, dragging down growth, and also what's known by economists as the crowding out effect. When the government spends money, it can crowd out private enterprise. Private enterprise can be less likely to spend monies in certain areas that the government is getting involved with. That is the purple blotches on this graph, and it shows it dragging down United Kingdom growth projections to when you get to 2028, 29, 2029, 30, that policy impact on real GDP has dragged it down below the waterline at a little below 0.0 and 0.1, minus 0.1%. That's a significant drag on growth. It's interesting to see the sugar rush in the first years there, funded of course by extra borrowing, by extra spending, but how quickly that runs out and how that's dragged down by both those national insurance tax rises and the crowding out effect of the government getting involved in many more elements of the economy. Stripping it down to its components, you can see that these changes are positive in the first couple of years after this budget, but then drag down that growth rate. You can see private consumption is lower, net trade is lower, business investment is lower. In fact, the only things propping up the picture in the early years are government consumption and government investment. This chart is incredibly clear. Less private consumption, less trade, less investment, only made up through more government consumption and more government investment. And of course, it's the private sector of the economy that generates the cash for the public sector. Here we can see the private part of the economy shrinking and the state element growing. That's an unsustainable trend. But what does this all mean for your mortgage? The Chancellor was vociferous in her criticism of the tax and spend changes made by Liz Truss in her famous mini-budget. Rachel Reeves said that meant higher mortgage rates. Of course, we saw mortgage rates rise in other countries around the world at roughly the same time. Similar interest rate rises in the United States, in Canada, in the European Union, in Australia, in New Zealand. The world over, practically, we saw these interest rate rises. But Rachel Reeves was very successful in politically pegging these rate rises, these sustained rate rises, to that mini-budget. Let's have a look at what Rachel Reeves' own budget changes about forecasts for mortgage rates. In their March forecast, the OBR expected rates to level off around 4% going off into the future. However, now, after the changes in Rachel Reeves' budget, mortgage rates rise to nearer 5%. That's the blue line on this graph. That's showing that mortgage rates are higher now than they otherwise would have been. That, of course, is thanks to the higher borrowing in this budget. And interestingly, in addition to those higher mortgage rates, this might be positive news for some homeowners. House prices are now not expected to drop. Indeed, house prices in 2025-26 are expected to rise and rise again, whereas in March, the OBR expected house prices to fall. Now, this could be for a number of reasons. Number one, and we'll get to this in a moment, net migration expectations are high. Number two, this could be a pessimistic view from the OBR around the expectation of planning reform from the government. The government was expecting to be able to allow many, many more homes to be built over the course of this Parliament. But judging by this graph from the OBR, that has not been factored into these calculations. House prices are expected to rise and rise and rise. And part of the reason for that could be the pessimistic attitude the OBR takes to planning reform thanks to the failure 3 times in the last decade or so of delivering it. Liz Truss, in her doomed mini-budget, promised investment zones that would liberalise planning in certain specific areas. This was campaigned against hard by various groups, including the RSPB, saying this could damage bird habitats, the building of too many houses. Similarly, in 2021, the Prime Minister, then Boris Johnson, tried to reform planning with his Planning for the Future white paper announced by his Housing Minister, Robert Jenrick. This was defeated after significant backbench rebellion. Indeed, going back to David Cameron's time as Prime Minister, with his planning minister Nick Boles, big reforms were attempted to be made of the arcane planning system in the UK that were again beaten back and watered down. 3 times under the last few Conservative Prime Ministers, planning attempted to be reformed. 3 times those reforms were defeated. Perhaps that's why the OBR says there's insufficient certainty to adjust any forecasts around the planning reform that this government has promised. The OBR writes that they'll continue to monitor developments, especially around the implementation of any such reform, given past reform attempts. Those are crucial words, given past reform attempts. It's a sceptical Office for Budget Responsibility that doesn't necessarily believe the Labour Party will be able to deliver one of its primary policy objectives. And finally, there is an interesting political calculation that has been made by the Treasury here. Underpinning all of the numbers in this red budget are net migration forecasts. Yes, it's expected that net migration, according to the numbers in this budget, will run at 315,000 a year into the long term. It's important to say that that is a considerable drop from the post-COVID spike in migration that this country experienced. However, it's nowhere near the level of the tens of thousands that the country experienced before 1997. 315,000 a year every year in perpetuity is the forecast that is being assumed at this budget. That's a new baseline level of migration, and that's a significant political moment. I have to say I asked the Treasury team about this assumption that their numbers are based off, because of course the OBR says that higher levels of migration allows you to do higher spending. The Treasury didn't want to get into any conversations about migration and simply passed me on to the Home Office. They said, that's a question for the Home Office. But is it a question for the Home Office when the Treasury clearly is basing its spending decisions on higher levels of migration? Surely it is also a question for the Treasury. Surely it is also a question for the Prime Minister. Is 315,000 a year the new normal for mass migration to this country? Is that a level that the Prime Minister is comfortable with? It's certainly what all of these sums have been based on. Now, of course, to stay up to date with all of the budget fallout and how it affects you, don't forget to subscribe to the GB News YouTube channel. We'll bring you all sorts of original content and the programming you know and love here on the GB News YouTube channel.